So I decided to use my beginning of year reading assessment as data for the analysis, considering it'll be the most similar to the data I plan on analyzing for my Action research project. This assessment is a 5-question assessment that we give students after reading them a story aloud. The test consists of 3 comprehension questions and then 2 vocabulary questions. The grading is fairly simple. It's a correct or incorrect answer. And because of this, I used ones and zeros, similar to the YouTube video we were provided with. I have 26 students this year, and I addressed them in the document by using the letters in the alphabet. I then include the numbers for the questions up top. And then I started to break down my data. I first looked at the average test score for each student. And then I went on to look at the average score for each question. So what this showed me was which students excelled at the beginning of the year assessments. I had a lot of 100s, which I was very surprised about since this was our first assessment. And then I had some more lower students, some 20s, 40s, 60s, which I am not that surprised about, being this is one of the first assessments kindergarten students receive. It was expected. Then looking a little bit closer at each question, these first 2 questions, comprehension questions, are fairly simple questions for the students to answer. Just asking about character in this, like what's the main character in the story, and then tell us one thing about that character that you know. So I'm not surprised that most students scored high on these. The last comprehension question is a retelling of main events in the story. So again, not very surprised that this is not scored as high as the first 2, because this requires a lot more attention to detail of the story and having to recall more events. The vocabulary questions, vocabulary can be difficult for kindergarten at first. You can show examples of a word, you can provide a visual of a word, but to describe a word can be challenging. So I'm not surprised that these scores are sitting where they're at. I am surprised that the score is 73 to 65. I expected them to be a little bit closer in averages there, so that was kind of a surprise to me. I then went on to look at the maximum, average, and minimum scores. So mentioned before, the maximum was 100, and the minimum was 20, and then the average was 75, which is amazing for the beginning of the year. So I was very pleased with that. Lastly, I looked at each category of questions. So I looked at the comprehension questions and then the vocabulary questions, and I looked at the averages for each of those. And then lastly, I looked at the average for each of those questions. So these are the average for each student in the composition and vocabulary questions, and then I took the average of each question. So again, 79% for comprehension, 69% for vocabulary. Not shocking there. What I did find shocking was some of the students scored a 67 on comprehension and then a 0 on vocabulary. So that would show me that this student needs a little bit extra help on vocabulary as well as comprehension. Whereas other students who scored 100 on comprehension and then 50 on vocabulary shows me that they've nailed comprehension, they can retell a story, but they're still struggling quite a bit with their vocabulary. And vice versa for some students who might need a little bit more help with their comprehension, but not so much with their vocabulary. So this data really shows me which each individual student needs. So this can really help me when grouping my students for small group. This is data that we look at who might need different types of interventions for comprehension or vocabulary, so I can provide this information to my reading specialists as well in my building. So this data is amazing to have. To just make it look a little bit cleaner, I did put all of this data into bar graphs. So this shows for each student, 1 to 26, what their percentage was for vocabulary questions and then comprehension questions. So again, this makes it a lot easier to kind of see that, for example, my first student might need some extra help with comprehension, but not so much for vocabulary. Same thing for my student number 24, might need a little bit extra help with vocabulary and comprehension. So this was just cleaner to look at. And then I also did the same for my class averages and the average of each question. So although I do like the Excel document and having all the scores there to look at, this was definitely nice to see, definitely a cleaner picture to look at. So this data lets me know that coming into kindergarten, most of my students still need some practice with comprehension and vocabulary skills. And this also allows me to see, like I mentioned before, that I need to work with specific students on their specific needs. So for example, student A here showed that they were able to answer the first 2 comprehension questions, but struggle with the third. So they might need more help with retelling, where they are solid on vocabulary. But student J down here might need some assistance on comprehension across the board and even a little more attention to vocabulary. The main thing I really like about this, as mentioned before, is how I can group my small groups. I do teach a half-day kindergarten program, so small groups to me is really the only time I have one-on-one with each student, and it really gives me and allows me time to break down what is necessary for them to grow. So this will really help me group my students and touch on specifics for what they need. And lastly, if anything, this just shows me that my teaching needs to be centered around comprehension as well as vocabulary to just help improve both test scores and bring my average score up and make sure my minimum score isn't as low as it was for the beginning of year assessment.